Um, Please be careful with the Asian food. Security asked me to ask y'all not to spill it. My name's Ian Greist. I'm the president of the Federalist Society chapter here at Texas Wesleyan. The Federalist Society is a nonpartisan, conservative/libertarian organization dedicated to fostering balanced and open debate about the fundamental principles of freedom, federalism, and judicial restraint. The Federalist Society seeks to educate the legal community through its programs and publications about how limited constitutional government based on the rule of law can have a positive effect on law and public policy. And today we have Professor Penrose, who we all know and love, and Nick Dranias, who is the Director of Policy Development and Constitutional Government at the Goldwater Institute. Dranias led the Goldwater Institute's successful challenge to Arizona's system of government campaign financing to the U.S. Supreme Court. Even before the case was accepted for review, he was able to persuade the court to intervene in lower court proceedings and block campaign subsidies from being paid to government-funded candidates during the 2010 election cycle. In addition to practicing constitutional law as a member of the Goldwater Institute's litigation team, Dranias served as a am I saying that right? Dranias, sorry. Served as a constitutional scholar. He has authored numerous scholarly articles dealing with a wide spectrum of issues in constitutional and regulatory policy, including the protection of free speech, the principle of state sovereignty, the reformation of excessive regulation, and the guarantee of individual liberty. And if you're interested in the Federalist Society and the events that we have, please join our page on Twen. You can get all our updates through there. And if you're interested in getting involved in the organization next year, please contact me through our Twen page and let me know that you're interested, because we need to recruit the people that are going to run it next year. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here because Professor Nick Penrose is one of the leading scholars in the area of the amendment by convention process. And my goal is to persuade her as much as I persuade you, because we need intellectual firepower like Professor Penrose on the side of structural reform for our nation. Because the fundamental problem is, at least on the right, a lot of our best and brightest are divided on this issue, and until we get united, we're never going to succeed in curtailing the abuse of power in Washington. That said, let's go. This is going to be rapid, and I'm going to get cut off in 5 minutes if I'm not where the Loch Ness Monster is, and you'll find out what that means. All right. The first thing I'm going to do is lay out why we need to consider structural reform in the form of a constitutional amendment. The second thing I'm going to do is explode some of the mythology around the use of Article 5's amendment by convention process. And third, I'm going to lay out the new legal product that we have developed at the Goldwater Institute called the Compact for America, which essentially transforms the amendment by convention process into the equivalent of a ballot measure for the states. Or put another way, it transforms the amendment process into a turnkey method for states to amend the Constitution. And for the first time, I believe we have a product that both answers all of the concerns ever expressed thus far by Professor Penrose, and that can get it done in our lifetime. So here's the problem. That's a real graph of our national debt. In nominal terms, we are now on an exponential increase that is simply unsustainable. Even if you look at this in terms of its relation to the GDP, we are now where we were at the height of access power in World War II in terms of borrowing. But the difference is this: when the bill comes due, we're not going to be the only economy standing, and on top of the national debt, we're going to have anywhere from $120 to $250 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So the ability that we had in the 50s to grow our way out of this debt does not, or at least there's a very significant risk, will not exist. You guys are going to face that calamity if we don't put a stop to it. Me too. Now we hear all we have to do is change the people who go to Washington, right? We just have to vote out the wrong people, put in the right people. Well, for how long have we been doing this? I'm kind of a strange guy. in high school in the 80s. During Reagan, I worked on the United Students for America Club. We did cookies for Contras. I remember the Reagan Revolution. And everybody was saying, oh, well, you know, we just get the right guy in charge, everything's going to be fine. It didn't work. Then we had the contract with America. All we have to do is just put Gingrich in charge. Everything's going to work out. We're going to have a great reduction in government growth and spending and debt. That didn't work out until you had divided government, and therein lies a lesson. We had a short period of time where we, in some senses, balanced the budget for a few years. That only happened when you had two opposing forces dividing the power of the federal government internally, and it did not last because the division of power was not sufficient. The problem is Washington will not tie its own hands. Even if it tries to, it will just find another way to feed. And the reason is concentrated power. If you put unlimited power in the hands of the ambitious souls that populate Washington, guess what happens? They use it. And particularly with the unlimited capacity to borrow, something that is alien to 49 states, all of which have either debt limits or balanced budget requirements, most of which work fairly well. When you have the unlimited capacity to borrow, you give politicians something that methamphetamine cannot compete with at all. Because what it enables them to do is borrow from future generations who do not vote to build pyramids today and shift the costs to others when they're safely out of office. That is why we have the growth of government that we've had. That is why we can never win the argument for limited government until we dispel the illusion of limitless resources with no political consequences that unlimited debt makes possible. Now we're going to try a thought experiment. One of the sort of false arguments against Article 5 in states initiating constitutional amendments is it's so difficult. How are we ever going to get it done? It takes so many states, and we'll get into the details of that later. What's important to recognize is that the serious and organized use of the state's power to originate constitutional amendments in and of itself, without ever even actually getting to an amendment, can have a powerful impact on the political status quo. It can disrupt the calculations of the political class in Washington all by itself. Let me prove it. Remember each of these debt limit debates? Remember when the states organized to fight Obamacare? 28 states collectively challenged Obamacare in court. Now just imagine if a similar seriousness in organization existed among the states during times like a debt limit debate. And as the debt limit debate proceeded to continue to kick the can and spend more and more money that you guys will have to pay back and your kids, imagine if one state after another was ticking off on an application for a balanced budget amendment. So that as the debate proceeded in Washington, it went from 1 state to 5 states, to 10 states, to 15 states, closer and closer and closer to the threshold for calling the convention to propose an amendment, to take away that power from Washington. On the margins, that threat would make a difference. It could change the votes in Congress all by itself. Let me give you another example. Who here remembers the debate over Obamacare? Do you recall how it failed on the first vote and barely passed on the second, and how they traded favors to the Cornhusker kickback and so forth to finally get it across the line? Think about this practically. Imagine the same 28 states that have challenged Obamacare, as the debate was proceeding, ticking off one application after another with an amendment idea that would take away the federal government's power. You can't tell me that wouldn't swing a vote. Same thing with Chief Justice Roberts' decision. We at least have some sort of remedy on the horizon. And then finally, if you remember TARP was even more egregious, because this is something the principal left and right united on. Overwhelmingly, no bailouts. Washington ignored us. Again, imagine the political dynamic. If blue states, purple states, and red states were ticking off overwhelming political will not to allow a bailout through a constitutional amendment. Don't tell me that wouldn't have flipped the votes. So the states have power under Article 5 just by using it in a serious way to affect change in Washington. It requires 2/3 of the state legislatures to call the convention through an application to Congress, requires Congress to call the convention, requires the convention to actually do something or propose something. Then it needs to come back to Congress, and Congress has to refer it out for ratification. This is a tough process we'll talk about. But let's first explode some mythology. First of all, the use of Article 5 is not some weird appendix that was never meant to actually be used in our Constitution. It was the central argument to very skeptical states and anti-federalists as to why they should trust the Federalists in creating the new federal government. And we know this from the Federalist Papers. Most importantly, we know this from Federalist 85, the final Federalist paper, the Federalist paper that summarized all of the reasons with the most important closing argument as to why to ratify the Constitution. Federalist 85 was entirely focused on refuting the anti-federalist argument for having a second constitutional convention by saying that you could use the targeted amendment process that was given to the states in Article 5 to effectuate whatever changes you needed if we got the balance of power wrong. That is the entire point of Federalist Number 85. It was the sales point for ratification. And it wasn't just an argument made in the Federalist Papers. As I'll point out later, there's other areas where it was made. But here's the other thing. When you hear about this runaway convention argument, it's important to emphasize that interstate conventions were not new at the time of the Philadelphia Convention. Over a dozen had taken place previously, interstate and intercolonial conventions. And the custom and practice clearly established going into the Philadelphia Convention is that they were controlled by the states. And they all had agendas, some broad, some narrow, and none of them ever exceeded their agenda, any more than a special session of the legislature ever really exceeds their agenda, because it is a self-constraining customary process. Now you're going to say, wow, that's not true about the Philadelphia Convention. In fact, to this day, esteemed law professors and historians claim that somehow the Philadelphia Convention went beyond the scope of its agenda. Well, we have this one major advantage these days. You don't have to rely on experts to verify things. You can go to the internet, specifically go to the Online Library of Liberty, a fantastic Liberty Fund resource, and you can actually look at the original documents. You can look at the congressional call, you can look at the state commissions that sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention, and you can see what they were charged to do. This is an actual copy of what is in the Journals of Congress as to what the delegates of the Philadelphia Convention were charged to do. This was replicated, with only a couple of exceptions, in every state commission for every delegate that went. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer to make the case that what they produced falls squarely within the scope of this agenda. It says they were going there to establish a firm national government. They weren't just there to revise the Articles of Confederation with just tweaks. It says such alterations and provisions that not would, just do a little minor change, but, quote, to render the federal constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. I mean, that is the agenda they went there for. This is a wide open agenda, and it shouldn't be any surprise that they emerge with something like a constitution. Now, the other arguments you'll hear as well, they changed the ratification requirements in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation required unanimous ratification. They required only, 10 states, 9 states? The problem with that argument is that the Articles of Confederation was merely a treaty. States were independent sovereign bodies, and any treaty can be, the states also reserve the power to make treaties independently of the Articles of Confederation with the consent of Congress. The Constitution itself was nothing more than a treaty for the states that signed on to it that was consented to by Congress, until such time as it finally displaced all of the Articles of Confederation when all of the states ratified it. So there's nothing about the Philadelphia Convention that was inconsistent with the processes or laws or understandings in place at the Articles of Confederation, and it certainly didn't run away. The people who claimed it ran away were the anti-federalists who didn't want the Constitution to be ratified, and they had to delegitimize it. Now, we also know this. Article 5 does not give anyone power to restart and rewrite the whole constitutional process. It does not create authority for another Philadelphia Convention. We know this very clearly. First, the ratification requirements of 3/4 of the states apply to both amendment by convention and proposals by Congress. It's in the same provision. It's in the same sentence. Second, you can go to the report of proceedings, either as reported in Farron's or Elliott's debates on September 15, 1787. You can watch and read the founders debating an amendment by convention process with no ratification requirement whatsoever, which would be analogous to a foundational convention, and they rejected it. Not once, not twice, but in in Elliott's debates, 4 times. And the last 2 times were unanimous. Now, legislators tell me that was meant to send a signal. And in light of the Federalist 85, when the founders make the point that we don't need a second constitutional convention because we have an adequate power to amend in Article 5, it makes sense. And finally, we know that it's not an unlimited foundational power because the text of Article 5 says that there are some amendments that are out of bounds. And that includes the amendment without the state's consent, depriving it of equal suffrage in the Senate. This tells you can't do a strike all. That if you did the widest ranging amendment possible from the convention, you would still be left with the states, their votes in the Senate, and the Senate, which would be what? Strikingly similar to the Articles of Confederation. Bottom line is, we know from custom practice what the founders themselves said, and subsequent discussions by the founders and the courts, that states set the agenda of an Article 5 convention. It's really important to emphasize that in the Virginia Ratification Convention, the specific point was made that you could confine this process to, quote, a few points. James Madison in 1800 responded to the Alien Sedition Acts by saying you could use Article 5 to repeal them. He also said that we shouldn't be doing nullification later because you could use Article 5 to restore the proper balance of power. And finally, the Supreme Court, as early as the 1830s, specifically said it was a convention of the states. And here's the crux of the issue. If Article 5 is a convention of the states, it's very easy to see why the states can control it. All you have to do is recall the principles of the 10th Amendment. Everything that's not prohibited to the states can do. Very simple. There's nothing in the Constitution that stops the states from regulating and determining how an Article 5 convention proceeds. Nothing. Nothing at all. And in fact, that's exactly what they did in all history, custom, and practice. But here's the problem. You need 100 acts to get it done. You need 34 state applications, 1 congressional call. You need to have at least 26 delegates show up at the convention. You got to have Congress refer the proposal if one is made. You got to have 38 ratifications, whether by convention or state legislature. This is Rube Goldberg's machine. And in fact, at the Virginia Ratification Convention, that was Patrick Henry's point. He said to the Federalists who were assuring the Anti-Federalists, oh, we didn't overly concentrate power in the federal government because, why, you states, you can amend it any time. Patrick Henry said, this is ridiculous. And for 6 hours, he argued that the central argument that there was adequate decentralization of power in the Constitution was a ruse. Sadly, he has a point. And this is why it's never been used successfully to conclusion, although, as I've pointed out, you could use it successfully for political effect. But what if we could make it easier? It is possible. Here's the product. You use a state compact, which is just an agreement among the states. Over 200 of them exist, as I'll talk about later. You use a congressional resolution. What you do is you pre-package in each of these legislative acts, singular legislative acts, everything that the states do on one side and everything that Congress does on the other. The secret sauce is what are called contingent effective dates, or conditional enactments. 44 states have even addressed the issue of whether those are allowed to be done, and 44 states have upheld them, including the U.S. Supreme Court. What am I talking about? A conditional enactment says a legislative act will only become effective if some other event happens, whether the passage of another legislative act or, somebody is born or whatever. But the basic idea is you can pass the law now and it only becomes effective when something in the future happens. If you use that device, that secret ingredient, you can pre-package on the state side everything that the states do in the Article 5 process in one piece of legislation. You can prepackage everything that Congress does on the other side in the Article 5 process. Here's how it looks. In the compact, you actually have the text of the proposed amendment. You define a commission of an interstate commission to organize the process, just to keep an institution in play, to keep it moving. You prepackage in the compact the application to Congress required by Article 5. You make sure that it only goes live at the right time. What you do, though, to make sure the process can be done from beginning to end without having to keep passing things in the states, is you say that this application only goes live when 38 states join the compact. Not 34, because there's no point starting something you can't finish. When the application goes live in the congressional resolution, there is already a call. That call will go live and say, we are calling the convention in accordance with the compact. When that happens, the compact, already prepackaged, appoints all the delegates. It sets all the convention rules, either directly or by instructing the delegates to vote these into place before they do anything else. The convention then will proceed subject to scope limitations laid out both in the instructions to the delegates and in the agenda. As soon as the convention generates something, if it matches the proposed amendment in the compact to begin with, it will trigger on the congressional side the previously nested ratification referral, which will only go live at that point. That in turn will trigger in the compact the previously nested ratification. Done. This cuts out 60% of the legislative acts needed for the ordinary Article 5 process. It's a concept that we've developed, fully researched, and I know it was distributed, our draft policy brief on this previously. For once, we actually have all questions answered and the process is feasible. Now, how is it realistic? As I already said, you go from over 100 enactments down to 39. All you need to do is have 38 states adopt the compact, Congress pass one omnibus resolution. Turns out, and I've been lobbying in about 30 states directly and indirectly on Article 5, most of these legislators don't even know they have the power to originate constitutional amendments, but they know about compacts. Why? There's over 200 in existence already. The average state is a party to 20 or more. Things like extraditing prisoners, cap and trade, military alliances even, to repel the Soviet invasion. I mean, there are crazy looking compacts out there, and they've been around forever. So, here's the benefit of the compact approach. You want to know what the logistics are? They're specified. You're concerned about who has the power to decide it? It's both the states and Congress. Because when Congress calls a convention, it blesses the compact under current law that transforms it into the, quote, law of the nation. What keeps it on target? There are 16 safeguards built into the compact. Let's go through them really quickly. Almost done. First of all, you've got the overwhelming political will behind 38 states and simple majorities of Congress. Second of all, everything's codified and regulated. There's no void to fill. It is, under current case law, both simultaneously state and federal law. You've got, in our case, governors designated as delegates. Now, they probably have a future beyond the convention. They're not going to act too crazy. The convention will not proceed because all the delegates can't proceed unless they adopt the limited agenda. It actually says that all states in the compact will treat as void ab initio anything that goes beyond its scope, meaning it's a nullity. It says that all delegates that violate the rules are automatically terminated and must return to state capital. It disqualifies all the rogue states from ratifying anything other than what it specifies. It says state legislatures can even affirmatively recall rogue delegates if they want. It limits the convention to 24 hours. If you think about it, there's no reason to have more than that for an up or down vote on a particular text. It prohibits all unauthorized proposals by any member state, any delegate. It says that anything that's generated by the convention is to be treated, other than the BBA it contemplates, is to be treated as a nullity. It actually affirmatively bars all the states from ratifying anything, and all we need is 13 of those to stick. It also says the state attorney generals must enforce it. Now, state attorney generals, by the way, are known as aspiring governors in many places. So that is another way to keep the governors honest. Finally, we selected the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and the federal and state courts of Texas to be the venue, which is actually a common venue selection type of provision in compacts. Then lastly, the commission, the Interstate Commission I introduced earlier, has the power to relocate the convention with adequate notice to member states if it looks like it's about to go bonkers. Presumably, if anything should happen, they could have even a virtual vote online. It doesn't get any safer than this, folks. It's bubble wrapped. It's now or never. Thank you.
First, let me thank Nick for coming to Dallas-Fort Worth. I think one of the amazing things I've watched the Federalist Society do during my time here at Texas Wesleyan is enable you as lawyers to see really vibrant, respectful, informed debate. And I think that's a fantastic thing that we can see as lawyers. When I got here, Nick, he wants to convince me. And I'm not yet convinced, and I probably won't be convinced, that calling an Article 5 Constitution is a good governmental solution to our problems. It doesn't mean I disagree, but I love the fact that he keeps writing, and he told me, Dave, because he goes, did you read what I recently wrote? And I said, this, and he said, no, I've tweaked it. Because one of the great things about informed debate is it requires all of us to raise our game to the next level. So I sincerely thank Ian and the Federalist Society for putting these together. I'm so grateful to you as students who want to come and share this dialogue. I want you to raise your hands and ask questions, either while I'm talking or during the question and answer session. I want you to come talk to us afterwards. I want you to email Nick. I want you to get involved. We are the future. He says now or never, but you are the future. You will decide these issues, ultimately, at some point. All right, fact number one. We have never had an Article 5 constitutional convention called through using the state model. None of the 27 amendments to the United States Constitution have ever gone under this model. Fact number two, we have no way to constrain the model. Not in the text of the Constitution. I would disagree even in a compact. One of the things I would start with, which is our first principal point of disagreement, is that the Philadelphia Convention did veer from its call from Congress. Congress wanted the Philadelphia Convention, which came on the heels of the Annapolis Convention. You need to study our Constitution. You need to go back and look at the text and how it was created. But these groups of individuals came to Philadelphia with the sole purpose, let's do some legislative assessment. Sole purpose means that's the only thing you're here to do, to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, Nick is correct that not only could they revise, I'm trying to recall how he phrased it, but all alteration and provisions were also permissible. But the problem is this, looking backwards, and history's all we have as our guide. I think another third important fact for both of us to admit is no matter how confident we are in our positions, no matter how well-researched our ideas are, neither of us can assure you that with a broken Congress and a Supreme Court that's not always at its highest moment, although it seems to be the highest regarded institution in our government right now, do we know how this will end up? No matter what I say to you today, it's prognostication. I don't know what will happen because it has never happened before. So I'm going to look to history. When the framers, the founders, came to Philadelphia, they were given very strict instructions by their states. Two groups, the group from Massachusetts and the group from New York, were told, you cannot do anything but revise the Articles of Confederation. One of the Massachusetts delegates' wife got sick, so he got to go home. That was fortunate. Two others became rogue delegates. They signed the Constitution, despite the fact that their state said you don't have the power to do it. Another rogue delegate, Alexander Hamilton. Have you heard of him? State of New York said you cannot sign that. That is not what we are here to do. You have been given your power from the state of New York to go and revise the Articles of Confederation. He did not sign as part of his delegation because he knew he was a rogue delegate. He signed as an individual. I think I also take issue with the point that this was a viable transition. Now, we all accept the Constitution. I'm not going to go back and say, all right, the Constitution is infirm and fatally flawed because it comes from a runaway convention. I just want to look to that model as what's potential during a time of great political upheaval frustration with your government? Does that sound at all, current to us today? I think it is. I think most of us would agree, would we not, that Washington's broken. Yet my guess is most of you went into the voter's box, which I hope you all voted, and most of you probably voted for the same people that are there right now. Nick and I disagree. I believe in the political process. Go vote everyone out of Washington. That changed things. You want someone that wants to actually get a balanced budget? Find them, have them run for office, have them step in. I have concerns. Otherwise, they'll step into this compact and it becomes a runaway convention. The Articles of Confederation required any revisions to be done unanimously. Philadelphia Convention said, well, yeah, I understand that's required, unanimity, but we're just going to require 9 states. So fundamentally, the Constitution was formed by veering from the compact. I believe that to be a very real and possible problem even moving forward. I think another place where we disagree is Nick has more faith than I do in Washington. I'm extremely suspicious. I don't necessarily trust that Congress will do what it's supposed to do in this process. We don't even know what its defined role is. I don't know whether the court would actually receive the case. The question of justiciability is very real and very uncertain. We saw in Bush versus Gore, the court turns an eye on justiciability. We're witnessing with the gay marriage case, maybe standing's going to step in the way. We don't yet know because the court is somewhat unpredictable. And as its compositions change, its jurisprudence changes. Same with Washington. Also, just let's be pragmatic. Who will determine under the text of the Constitution whether a Constitution Convention can be called? Who's going to do the math and count the numbers? Congress. That should also give you pause. Chances are they're not going to do it in the most candid way. And one of the problems we have right now, because I think the number's close to 10,000 of these different state amendments and calls for a constitutional convention, every single state in the Union, all 50 states, have at one time or another called for a constitutional convention. Texas has been in the mix. Just this week, Indiana passed a resolution, and here's what they want to do. They want to call, the state of Indiana has issued a call under Article 5 for a constitutional convention. It wants to reassess the Commerce Clause, Article 1 of the Constitution. It also wants to reassess the taxation power of the United States government. That's what's going to happen in my opinion, although again, all I can tell you is I'm predicting. I have no possible way of knowing for certain whether people would be properly restrained, whether we would get good, honorable, non-ambitious, open-minded individuals into this paradigm. And I just have distrust. I have less faith that we will. But Indiana, all they care about is the Commerce Clause and taxes. Georgia then has come in and now they want to have some things brought up. They want a limited constitutional convention. They're upset with the 17th Amendment, which allows for the legislature to appoint U.S. senators. They want to go backwards. And so they want to repeal the 17th Amendment. They also want to repeal the 16th Amendment. Other states like Kansas and various others want to talk about the Second Amendment and gun control, abortion, prayer in school, gay marriage, flag burning. All of these things could possibly be on the table. I think the special interest groups are everywhere. I think someone who's fighting for a balanced budget has a special interest. I think that's not the only group that's going to come together at this event, and I think that poses a real and serious risk constitutionally. The best evidence I have of that happens to be Chief Justice Warren Burger. Hopefully all of you are familiar with Chief Justice Burger. He drafted a letter in 1988, and he wrote this to an individual. I have repeatedly given my opinion that there is no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules and set its own agenda. Congress might try to limit the convention to one amendment or to one issue, but there is no way to assure that the convention would obey. After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda. The meeting in 1787 ignored the limit placed by the Confederation Congress for the sole and express purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. So Chief Justice Warren Burger expressed in 1988 very serious reservations about moving forward with an Article 5 Constitution. He feared the runaway convention. He concludes the letter by cautioning whatever gain might be hoped for from a new constitutional convention could not be worth the risks involved. A new convention could plunge our nation into constitutional confusion and confrontation at every turn, with no assurance that focus would be on the subjects needing attention. So I agree with him. I think he's a very solid source of both constitutional history and constitutional jurisprudence. You may or may not like him personally, you may or may not have agreed with his philosophy, but what most people will say about him was he was good in the administration of the courts. That was probably his greatest strength as a Chief Justice. Former Associate Justice Arthur Goldberg of the United States Supreme Court wrote in the Miami Herald in 1986, "One of the most serious problems Article 5 poses is a runaway convention. There is no enforceable mechanism to prevent a convention from reporting out wholesale changes to our Constitution and Bill of Rights. Moreover, the absence of any mechanism to ensure representative selection of delegates could put a runaway convention in the hands of single-issue groups whose self-interest may be contrary to our national well-being." And I shared with Nick, I have a different feeling about constitutionalizing a balanced budget. Here's why. What happens when an emergency hits our country? If we have a constitutional requirement that budget must be balanced, and someone attacks our shores like 9/11, where are you going to get the money to go to war? The states have locked us in, said, you're going to have to take it from something. You're going to shut down a program? You're going to start shutting down federal aid to education? What happens when you have an event like a hurricane, Katrina? Where are you going to get the money if we're locked in? Now, I'm not in favor of reckless spending. I don't understand how we went from the time of Bill Clinton, where he had a balanced budget. We lived during those times. But what spun our budget out of control was war. 9/11, us coming under attack, we abandoned the balanced budget process, and we can't seem to get us back on order. Why? Because I'm sitting there watching the news this morning. People are talking about helping Syria. Not my problem. We need to balance our checking account. You know what? Americans are like, help Syria. But the minute you constitutionalize something, then you risk exactly what we had with prohibition and the repeal of prohibition. This time period at which you realize the experiment was not worth it, that it was problematic. Justice Goldberg continues, history is established. So here's the second person that said the Philadelphia Convention, which gave us our fantastic Constitution, was flawed in its process. They cheated. That's just the most polite way you can say it. They didn't follow the rules of order or their call by Congress. Justice Goldberg said, history has established that the Philadelphia Convention was a success, but it cannot be denied that it broke every restraint intended to limit its power and agenda. Logic, therefore, compels one conclusion. Any claim that Congress could, by statute, or I would say compact, limit a convention's agenda is pure speculation, and any attempt at limiting the agenda would almost certainly be unenforceable. It would create a sense of security where none exists, and it would project a false image of unity. And that's my concern. Many of you that have had me in class know I'm not a super fan of our Constitution. I think the Constitution's broken. But I'm not sure that the Article 5 process is the adequate way or the best way to deal with it. These concerns I have are not mine and mine alone. I've given you two justices from the Supreme Court. But in 1973, the American Bar Association stepped forward. They actually conducted a study, a couple of year-long study with judges, a law professor, a law school dean, fantastic lawyers, and they came up with some concerns they had about the Article 5 convention process. I'm going to read you the 9 questions, and I'm going to yield the floor back to Nick here. Here's what the ABA said we need to think about. If the legislatures of 2/3 of the states apply for a convention limited to a specific matter, must Congress call such a convention? And implicit in that question is, who's interpreting whether we've had the requisite number of calls for a constitution? Because Congress can say, well, in this one you said you wanted to do the Second Amendment and a balanced budget, and in this one you said you only wanted a balanced budget. My sense is that the response will be this compact, it's all the exact same paper, it's coming from the Goldwater Institute, they're giving it to them, they're filling out the forms, just sign it, we can move forward. That is one way to assure mathematically that the math is not a problem. Question 2, if a convention is called, is the limitation binding on the convention? In 1973, the ABA was unsure about that. Question 3, what constitutes a ballot application which Congress must count, and who is to judge its validity? Is this even a justiciable question? Would the Supreme Court be able to step in when the states and the Congress are battling? Question 4, what is the length of time in which applications for a convention will be counted? Calls for a balanced budget are not new. Calls for an Article 5 convention for a balanced budget are not new. They were very pervasive in the 1980s. They were very pervasive in the early 1990s. That's probably how we got to the balanced budget under President Bill Clinton. Question number 5. How much power does Congress have as to the scope of a convention, as to procedures such as the selection of delegates, as to the voting requirements at a convention, as to refusing to submit to the states for ratification the product of a convention? 6. What are the roles of the President and the state governors in amending the process? 7. Can a legislature withdraw an application for a convention once it has been submitted to Congress, or rescind a previous ratification or proposed amendment or previous rejection? What are we going to do with all these various things that have been coming and going for years? 8. Are issues arising in the convention process justiciable under Article 3? Can we even turn to the courts if we have a problem? And the last question they say, number 9, is who is to decide questions of ratification? I think that the point at which I disagree with Nick is not on the substance. Do I want a balanced budget? Absolutely. I think it's the solution, the path that we arrive at that solution. And with all due respect, I'm concerned, I'm much more cautious and even concerned about the Article 5 model, but I could be completely wrong. Thank you.
Well, I want to think that we don't need to have any more bubble wrap than that. The bottom line is this: if you want a runaway convention, all you have to do is look to Washington. The runaway convention happens in the legislative branches, the executive branches, and even sometimes the judicial branches all the time in Washington. So the reality of the status quo is that everything that Professor Penrose fears is the normal conduct of business of the federal government. And the question is, what is the fundamental cause of this? Is the solution really just to replace the people who populate Washington 3,000 miles away from some places, 2,000 miles away from others? Or is the solution the one that animated the Constitution in the first place, which is a dividing power vertically as well as horizontally? Remember, the Constitution was originally designed for the states to have a role in the U.S. Senate and to effectively control by proxy half of all of federal policy. And that was removed with the 17th Amendment. So we haven't had an effective vertical check from the states since then. And we've had a concentration of power that the founders never expected to exist in Washington. So the problem with Professor Penrose's fundamental analysis, and one I hope that she will consider to be wrong someday, is that we don't have the system of divided power that we need to have for ambition to balance against ambition adequately. And the idea that all we have to do is vote in good people as the solution has never been the solution the founders envisioned. The founders tried to design a system that could handle a very heavy load of bad actors. And to have that kind of system, you've got to have separation of powers both horizontally and vertically. Now, in terms of the states, here's a very, very basic constitutional perspective on why states can limit the Article 5 process. Remember the principles of the 10th Amendment. All powers that are not delegated to the federal government, that are not prohibited to the states, are retained by the states. There is nothing in Article 5 that even remotely suggests that the states cannot regulate or limit the convention. All of history and practice shows that the states did, in fact, regulate, direct, and limit the convention. Even Professor Penrose admitted that when Alexander Hamilton tried to go rogue, he had to sign his own name. So the reality is, the people who claim that the states cannot limit the Article 5 convention process have the burden of proof, because they're inverting the Constitution's power structure. They're demanding that the states prove they have a power when the default assumption of the Constitution is that the states have the power unless they are prohibited from having it. So, in the end, the question is, why not? Why not? Is the reward worth the risk? What is the alternative? As I said from the beginning, Congress is never going to fix itself. It's never going to tie its own hands. Whatever temporary truces exist on the growth of government, those only arise because of the separation of powers horizontally, and they're temporary because it's not adequate. You need to have the vertical separation as well. And if states can answer all of these questions, and the Compact for America does, about logistics, and if the states, if you believe in the 10th Amendment's principle, that the states have all powers not delegated to the federal government and not prohibited to them, then there is simply no reason in the world not to take this option. And in the end, against all the esteemed justices that say otherwise, and by the way, Justice Scalia is on my side, as is Ronald Reagan, leaving aside all those arguments from authority, from current justices, I just want to remind everyone, I think the best authority is James Madison, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton. And in the end, if you're looking for proof that Article 5 is a critical component of the constitutional design controlled by the states that can be limited to a few discrete areas, just read Federalist 85. If there's nothing else that you do, just read Federalist 85. And everyone who tells you that the Philadelphia Convention ran away, just read the congressional call, and now as you're all budding lawyers, ask yourself, gee, could I make an argument that the Constitution falls within the scope of this call? I think just about any reasonably competent attorney could. And the fact that 18 or 20 historians say, no, it ran away anyhow, can't change the fact that if you look at the original documents, it doesn't take anything other than taking it as plain meaning. And the term revise, and I want to end on this, because it's relevant. You may recall that one of the issues over the Prop 8 in California was whether it was a revision or an amendment. And that there was a distinction that the courts in California were talking about between the scope of a proper amendment versus the scope of a revision. And the test in California, going back to the early 1800s, or the mid-1800s, when they first devised their constitution, was that a revision was a whole-scale change, a structural amendment that changes the whole scope of the Constitution, whereas an amendment is more limited in scope. Now that concept of the distinction between a revision and amendment is not something unique to California. It was alive at the time of the founding era. There were courts or councils of revision that dealt with state constitutions. And the use of the term revise, far from being a limiting term, was actually signaling a broader scope, fully consistent with the incredibly broad scope of the call. And just because a few states sent their delegates in there with maybe something more limited, in the end there were enough votes to carry the day anyhow. So I'd be happy to take any questions, but in the end, look, nothing in life is without some risk. The question is, do we have a big enough reward, and have we minimized the risk enough to take the action? We have done that with the Compact. We've heard Professor Penrose's concerns about knowing in advance the logistics. We've laid it all out, and the foundation of our position is very simple. States, under the 10th Amendment, have the power to do what is not prohibited of them. Thank you.
Does anyone have questions?
I'm sorry, I forgot your name, sir.
Call me Nick.
Nick, I'm very sympathetic to this idea. I mean, I think, like you, it seems like Professor Penrose says as well, the federal government has become very out of control, but in terms of how this process would work, I read an article in a magazine, National Review, a few years ago. They're a very conservative magazine, and they said that, like, if you were to have a convention like this, it could turn out to be like a madhouse. Say, like, you have something
Kind of like Congress.
yeah, like, but I mean, you have abortion, say, for instance, and then you have, these sort of forces swoop on each other, and nothing gets accomplished. But even if it does, I mean, if it's a congressional resolution, can it be enforced by the courts or by Congress? I mean, how would the process exactly work, and how would you keep some of the more extreme elements from turning it into just like a circus?
Well, the first thing is you need something like a compact. I think that 2 years ago, when I would argue for the plain vanilla approach to Article 5, just pass an application, see what happens, I think I was wrong. And I was wrong because I think there were very cogent, practical arguments about how many times are you going to pass a pig in a poke? I mean, in a way, even if you have a limited application, even if you have it subject matter limited, even if you believe it can't and will be enforced, how do you know that you're going to get something that was worth the effort? How do you know that it won't just fizzle? I mean, these are legitimate questions. And so I set out to say, okay, can we answer them? And then I remembered the 10th Amendment. And I remembered that all states that are not prohibited, all powers that are not prohibited to the states or delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. And I looked at Professor Davison's work and the fact that history shows that the states customarily controlled and limited the process. And I looked at the founder's own words. Most significant to me was James Madison's report on the Virginia resolutions in response to the Alien and Sedition Act. It was most significant to me emotionally because I thought the Alien and Sedition Act shows just how any generation, even the founders, can be corrupted. But what was significant about Madison's report is everyone focuses on the nullification and the position stuff, but they ignore the fact that he says that you should use Article 5 for, quote, the object of repealing these laws. So it was manifestly clear to me that the founders intended for the states to have these powers. From the structure of the Constitution, from what they said, that the states can regulate. And so we set out to do that. And the compact idea, you can go to compactforamerica.org, you can see everything's defined, everything in the process, even the rules. We lay out the parliamentary rules as well. So all those answers have been given. Now you're asking a question, well, how do we know that the courts will enforce them? I agree with Professor Penrose. We're engaging in prognostication and the assumption that courts are going to be behaving, on the whole, more lawful than lawless. And that's not a guaranteed assumption, but nothing in politics is. You see, you can't just look for this utopian, perfect model where nothing wrong can ever happen. What you have to do is say, okay, what are the rewards? What are the risks? Have we done everything reasonably possible to minimize the risk and maximize the reward? If we don't do this and we let the status quo play out, are we going to be better off? And all the craziness that people talk about happening at a runaway convention is the status quo. I mean, look at what the EPA does day and night. Look at what the federal government does day and night. Look at the drones ideas that Rand Paul had to stand up and filibuster for 13 hours over. I mean, the very problems that you are worried about arising possibly in the context of the convention is every day. So relative to the alternatives, I'm not saying that I can guarantee that Justice Scalia and four of the justices are going to rule squarely in line with what the law should be. What I'm saying is we've done everything reasonably possible to minimize the risk, maximize the reward, and I believe that a reasonable person would prefer this approach to not using it or to rely solely on the status quo, particularly since the Constitution's design is not what the founders intended. We do not have the vertical check that was intended right now.
Why don't you go ahead?
So my question is, I agree with you that the states need to take a little bit more power, but how would this influence the overall stability, not only from general public's view of the stability of government, but also other countries and their view of whether or not we have a stable government, because that will affect our economy.
Well, I look at government, I don't see a whole lot of stability. I see one game of chicken after another. I see battles over every conceivable issue, tooth and nail. So again, it's a question of relative risk and reward. Status quo versus this option. What does this option give us that doesn't currently exist? It changes the focus of the political class in Washington, right? I mean, at minimum, as I pointed out at the beginning of my presentation, it forces Washington to consider what's happening in the states and in their national policy making. It makes it more relevant to them. As I said from the beginning, imagine the debate over Obamacare or TARP or the debt limit. If states use this power systematically, and why is that a good thing? Because state legislators are closer to us. They're earlier in their career. They actually have to care more about us, right? And as long as the American people, poll after poll after poll, show better instincts than the politicians do, it's a good thing to favor that dynamic. Now, maybe a day will come when we would rather have our overlords in Washington decide everything, but we're not there yet. So structurally, it's a benefit to decentralize that power, and it's the only way to fix Washington, because you know what? Good people get corrupted in Washington. They get corrupted because unlimited power corrupts. We don't have to watch The Lord of the Rings to know this. And so the way you prevent that is you ensure that there are adequate checks and balances, move us closer to where the founders had us. Not because we just like, structure, but because we want a system that can handle a heavy load of bad people, because they're always going to be there.
Has the growth of the size of the country from, well, this was drafted when we had only needed 9 states to pass this, to now we need nearly 40. Does that make a logistical improbability of getting this to work?
Absolutely. It's very difficult without a compact. Even with a compact, 39 pieces of legislation, getting one piece through Congress unmolested and 38 passed unmolested, very, very challenging. But I have reason to believe it's possible because there are 200 interstate compacts already. There are probably a half a dozen compacts in 30 or more states with congressional approval that are all identical. And a lot of these compacts are on much stranger, weirder topics. I mean, most recently you got that effort to bypass the Electoral College coming out called the popular vote or whatever. And then before that, the cap and trade thing out east. And then before that, you had military alliances that repel the Soviet invasion in the Northeast in the 50s. So what I see is a political reality in which compacts, identical compacts, appear to have the ability to reach a critical mass of support and passage, and then everybody's kind of jumps on. And then the analogy given to me by the chief of staff, the Governor Brewer, Mike Hunter, or maybe his fiscal policy guy, was it's kind of like you're pushing a wheelbarrow, frogs are jumping in. At some point, so many frogs are jumping in that they all want to jump in. And I see that dynamic. Now, this is an empirical judgment. The question is, what's the alternative, right? The cool thing about Article 5 is you don't have to get to the convention. This is the point that I'm making. All we've got is 25 or 30 states who will play. It's significant. It can change votes. It can make the political calculus in Washington a little bit more tenuous, if only for this reason. It's proof of concept for political entrepreneurs, right? Political entrepreneurs that see the kind of political will behind something that can get to 25 states are going to say, maybe I could build a career around that, right? So on the margins, you will change how Washington behaves. And that matters, because where are we changing them to? We're changing them to positions that resonate more closer to the people. And as long as the people are better than they are over the run of the game, it's better to do that.
I know a lot of y'all have class, so I don't want to keep you too long, but I'm sure if you have more questions, the speakers will be happy to stick around.
Sure.
So, thank you all for coming. And, yeah, if you want to.
You told us about this compact idea, and you said you've been speaking to some legislatures about it. Has anyone adopted this yet and actually tried to pass the compact?
It was introduced in Arizona and in New Mexico. We tried to loose as a trial, just to see how it would resonate, because we don't yet have a $30 million budget. But it was interestingly on the blue state, it was tabled. So the Dems could bring themselves to vote it down, which is unusual. They usually don't hesitate. And in Arizona, the problem was friendly fire. We got through the initial committee, we got to rules, and by then, folks who feared the runaway convention influenced the rules attorney and chief. But keep in mind, this was on a shoestring budget with nothing more than a handful of people making the case and a think tank. The design for the Compact for America is to have a $30 million budget, to have lobbying teams in all 50 states, and to move this as more of a sort of a presidential campaign vehicle. I mean, not because we're running with a president, but just as a kind of gigantic thing. Because that's what you need. See, the reality is for all of these things, the grassroots gets you only so far. You have to, the political entrepreneurial aspect of proving that there's a reward and a punishment to the political class by either supporting or opposing it, I'm finding is the most important thing even to a lobby. Persuasion gets you far, but in the end, if there's no positive or negative consequence politically, you can't get the majority of non-principled political careerists on your side who get paid. So it's going to be a building process, and but one of the benefits we have is we have an advisory council that's incredibly deep. We have Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Harold Tomas on our advisory council, who's written a white paper on this. We've got Kevin Goodsman, who's written a number of, Dr. Kevin Goodsman, who's written a number of books, one most recently on James Madison. He's on top of this. We've had a lot of good media interest, different, Lars Larson, Steve Dice, and others. So we've gotten a lot of buzz. Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst showed up at, well, I forgot to mention, I was on the ballroom floor on Robert Norquist's BBA panel at CPAC. It was very well received. Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst invited himself to our panel the next day at breakfast to speak, and publicly expressed that he'd like to support the idea. Now, I don't know what that means, but nevertheless, it's positive. And the challenge we have is we've been trying to get some support on the center line. And the best we can do so far is get neutrality. And the reality is, to get to 38 states like we need, we got to have some pretty purple states. And the BBA concept that we have, I think, can appeal to this, because it deals somewhat with the problem of not favoring a completely right-wing philosophy. Because what we do is we say you have to have a balanced budget, except you can raise, you can have a revolving line of credit that you can raise with approval of a majority of states. And so our argument to the left is all we're doing is decentralizing the argument over debt. Yes, it's an additional check. Yes, it brings back some of the vertical checks and balances that existed in the pre-17th Amendment era. But you know what? You may have an aircraft carrier you don't want to fund, or a war you don't want to fund. So, you can take that battle to your state legislature and decentralize it from Washington and make it closer to the people. That has resonated marginally well on the left. The idea of taking the power to lift the federal debt limit out of Washington and giving it to the states resonates a heck of a lot better on the right, because they understand the vertical separation of power element to it and how it restores a big chunk of what used to be before the 17th Amendment without actually taking away anyone's right to vote for the U.S. Senate, which is a very hard sell. Do I have hope? Absolutely. We've got also on our team John McLaughlin and Mark McKinnon as political consultants. You might see them on MSNBC and Fox News from time to time. Mark McKinnon used to run McCain's, an aspect of McCain's presidential campaign. So we're trying to lay this out in a way that we're not all like hard right libertarians. We've got a span of people, and but Professor Penrose is right. To a certain extent, there is a big group of Article 5 people who just want a free-for-all, and they want that. And so what's cool about the compact is we're rooting out who in the Article 5 movement are those people, and who in the Article 5 movement are people who want to use it the way the founders intended. So at the very least, we're getting very valuable intel in terms of who really are our friends on the left and on the center, and who really aren't. And I suspect, well, we already kind of know who they are. It's definitely not Occupy Wall Street. But I'd like to think there might be somebody there who would.
Go ahead.
Who would pay for this? How much do you think it would cost? The
Well,
convention itself.
If you have a checkbook.
And isn't an argument against, well, assuming a runaway thing where they pass a whole bunch of amendments, it still has to be ratified by number 6, so isn't that a...
Yeah. I mean, in the end, the ultimate backstop is the 38 state requirement for ratification. But keep in mind, the runaway convention people, the more creative of them, claim that the convention could even bypass the ratification requirement based on, again, my claim that they misconstrue the Philadelphia Convention, based on the Philadelphia Convention's practice. So they argue that there's something intrinsic in the convention that just makes it unconstrainable. The counter-argument to that, I think, first and foremost, is a practical one. I mean, if you've got a compact like we've designed, which actually, by the way, one of the features is that it has to get done in 2 years. The way we've designed it is it fizzles if you don't have it all done from beginning to end in 2 years. So we did that. Yeah, everything done. The reason why we did that is we wanted to make sure that there was contemporaneous political will in play to mollify that concern, because in the end, I think the biggest check is not so much parchment, but it's political will and institutions. And if you've got 38 states, purple and red, simple majorities of Congress, which need to bless the compact, in a contemporaneous short time frame, all saying we do this, anybody who says, "Ah, let's go take over the world," I mean, he'll be standing on a street corner with a sign. I mean, it will not have any resonance. And so, we have very carefully designed into our system, even though I disagree with that point of view, even though I think it's incorrect, and I think the risk-reward assessment is wrong, we've actually designed the compact to make even them feel comfortable, because are they seriously going to say, is someone really going to say that if 38 states, all their governors, and a simple majority of Congress get behind a specific, tightly defined compact, that when a guy stands up in a room somewhere with a bunch of guys and says, let's just do something completely different, do you really worry about that? I mean, I think in our political context that is not a serious worry. Not that it can't happen, it's just, think of all the other horrible things that can happen in the Department of Homeland Security in the meantime.
I have a question for Professor Penrose. With your fear of the Article 5 process,
Right.
what do you see its purpose in being in our Constitution?
No, I think the Article 5 purpose in the Constitution was exactly to give the states a check on Congress and to give an alternate method to amend the Constitution. But Congress is going to play a role in Article 5. When you read the text of the Constitution, you can't circumvent Congress. So part of my difficulty, and again, it's my lack of faith in the current government, I'm not convinced someone won't stand and filibuster the consideration of a call for the Constitutional Convention. And I think at some point, it will become a circus. And then when there's that problem in Congress, someone's going to go to the court. And then the question becomes, is it a justiciable question? And there have been 2 cases before the United States Supreme Court before on Article 5 as to how you count them and whether you can retract your ratification. And they go back to the 1920s. So, I mean, they're older cases. I think it was intended to be a check if the federal government was completely broken. So I agree on that point. The problem is the mechanism inherently requires you to resort to the broken process to cure it. So basically, the disease becomes the cure, and I think where we veer most clearly is I do have a different interpretation of what happened in the Philadelphia Convention. I mean, it required unanimity to revise. Whatever definition, whatever way you want to absorb the word revise, it required unanimity. So when the policy was changed to require 9 states rather than all of the states to revise the Article of Confederation, which ultimately became the United States Constitution, so many more educated and thoughtful people than me have stepped in and said, the state model's really treacherous. Now, the Constitution's been amended 27 times, but not even that often if you take the first 12 amendments, because they're somewhat contemporaneous, and the 27th was actually introduced in the first Congress, but because we didn't have a time limit for ratification, it's the most recent amendment. So it's somewhat curious. And then you got the Civil War amendments, and you've got a few that came right after the founding. If you really look at the Constitution, for better or worse, Chief Justice Marshall made the appropriate way for keeping it fluid rather than static, keeping the check and the import of the 10th Amendment in place. Chief Justice Marshall put that in the hands of the judiciary. And that may disturb a lot of people, but I think that is where the ultimate check has been placed. And I don't see how you have any Article 5 proceeding, because you're going to have someone come in and say, hold on, there's this group that's got all this money, which sounds like a special interest group, so it's going to scare people. And they got to have their compact, and someone that wants to legalize marijuana, and someone wants to outlaw abortion, and someone that, all these elements of special interest groups are going to step in line, and you're going to get the constitutional chaos that some people predict. Or you may not, because I do think a balanced budget is something the majority of people agree to, but I think once you put something in the Constitution, even if what Nick is saying is, well, all you have to do is go get a majority of the states to agree if we need to go to war. That's like saying you give your parents permission to tell you when you can write a check, right? I don't, with all deference to my parents, I'm grown up. And I may not like the way that Washington spends my money. That's why I vote, I want to see term limits. I want to see ways to correct the political process, because actually this is just an alternative political process. it's going to mirror exactly what we have in Congress. You gotta get delegates, you're gonna give them a set of rules, they're gonna agree or disagree. How is that any different from the system we have now? The difference is it's unelected people, because we don't know. Only Congress has the power to determine the model that is used. Whether you go to state legislatures or whether you call a state convention, they ultimately get to determine ratifications. No compact can do it. That falls directly under Article 5 in the hands of Congress. And so there will be machinations, absolutely, and I think that's my concern. If ever there was a time to avoid Congress, I think it's when their approval ratings hovering about 12%. I don't want to see them, because the Constitution is a sacred document. It has outlived perhaps its usefulness, so maybe, I mean, Sanford Levinson at the University of Texas, the reason he wants a convention, he wants the runaway convention. He went to the Harvard discussion, and he was there, and he kept saying, we need to start from scratch, the document's broken.
Yeah, I think the most powerful argument against any Article 5 effort is the unfortunate fact that you have Congress involved. There's two ways to deal with that. One is to point out that in the Federalist paper number 85, the paper you should all go and read, you can point out that Alexander Hamilton says that Congress's obligation was preemptory, which has a meaning in law at the time to refer to writs of mandamus and ministerial duties that can be compelled by courts appropriately. Preemptory writs are the class of writ that mandamus applies to. Mandamus is the remedy where a court can compel an elected official to take specific action. So when Alexander Hamilton described Congress's duty in Federalist 85 as preemptory, is a very pregnant term to use. And most of the founders had familiarity with the law. Many were attorneys. So you can make a very strong legal argument that you could go into court and, whatever the political question doctrine may be, and other aspects of Article 5, the call was designed to be preemptory, subject to preemptory writ. And I think that argument should win, clearly should win. Nevertheless, in the end, courts can be political, Congress can be political. So the question is, so I happen to believe that, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with trying litigation on this, but I think the better answer is political will. And we've designed the compact to maximize political will to make a guy like Chief Justice Roberts, who was worried about overturning the harmony of the court and society and Obamacare, think twice before he does anything to disrupt this process. Because you'll have 38 states organized as an institution in quick order, represented by an interstate commission acting as kind of a shadow Senate, with one purpose in mind. Fully organized and with the governor serving as delegates. So just imagine the political will, power, opportunity, and risk involved in frustrating this entity that you've created. Then couple it with this fact. We've designed the congressional component, the resolution, to be passable at any time. Now, we do that, again, to the contingent effective dates. The components in it, the call, the referral, only go live when the compact goes live. So you could pass this resolution at any time. Now they could repeal it later, nothing to keep it entrenched, but you could pass it at any time. And so the goal that we have politically is to run it up the middle whenever we see that opportunity open up in Congress. I mean, just like a Gingrich and a Clinton were able to reach a temporary truce on the growth of government, we think that there will be opportunities to run that up the middle. And we do know that in the Senate, for example, there are Democrats who are, we know from our political consultants, there are probably 6 to 8 Democrats who would support some measure of fiscal restraint along the lines of what we're discussing. So, there's no question getting around Congress is a huge problem, and it is, I think, a defect in the design of Article 5. I think we have to admit that. This purpose was to allow states to check and balance Washington, having Congress be the gatekeeper, even if it's preemptory, doesn't make a whole lot of sense because people aren't nice. Government is not populated by angels. Why would we assume Congress is going to do their duty? Nevertheless, what's unique about the compact is both we create a shadow institution that masses in contemporaneous time incredible political will with, beyond any sort of legal threat, shows the political entrepreneurs there are consequences, right? And we have the congressional component movable at our option, whenever the stars align. If we're ever going to do this, this is the only way to do this. And we're finding, for example, Lou Euler at CPAC, he's one of the original guys behind the Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, effort to bring a balanced budget into being in the 1980s. He gave me his blessing during our panel discussion. He said, you know, this young man's got maybe the right idea to do this, and then later on he strengthened it. He famously actually tried to use ballot measures to compel California to apply to Congress for a balanced budget amendment, and the California court struck it down. He did an emergency writ to Rehnquist. Rehnquist refused to stay the decision, saying that in California, an application is a resolution not subject to a ballot measure, which is statutory. And he said, I mean, you have an independent ground under state law not to let that go forward, so I'm leaving it alone. But interestingly, Rehnquist did say in his decision, in Euler versus California, or it was maybe the Secretary of State, but Rehnquist did say that he was not treating this as a political question. And we know that Chief Justice Roberts is his law clerk. And we know that Scalia supports the process. He's written letters. So I think the political question concern is minimal right now with the composition of the court, if you had to litigate. But I'm not designing, we haven't designed this compact for litigation. We've designed this to mask political will in real time that makes it impossible for a sane politician to say no. That doesn't mean there aren't insane politicians.
Go ahead.
Sir, you mentioned in your last answer that this commission would be a shadow Senate. And doesn't that raise concerns? Because if you're trying to give the states back vertical check, why not just push to repeal the 17th Amendment and put it back like it was? I mean, I have issues with people that are not elected being in a commission that are going to affect our core governing document.
That's a completely valid criticism. The commission's role is so tightly defined to simply organizing the convention around that particular BBA, and it's populated by the governors of the states that will go there. And it has a sunset provision that says when the BBA is ratified, it goes away, that I think we've reasonably balanced that concern with the need for an institutional force to threaten and to create political consequences for Washington. I mean, in the end, again, it's a risk-reward analysis. You have to ask yourself, what are the risks, what are the rewards, what are the alternatives? It's a tricky balancing act anytime you create any governmental structure, right? I mean, it would be great if we could just say no more governmental structures and we have nothing to worry about. But the question is, in the reality in which we have unlimited centralized authority in Washington, at least through debt and now through the taxing power, what is more dangerous? Is it really more dangerous to have a side institution organized around and putting in place a BBA that is controlled by the states? Or is it more dangerous not to have that institution? And I think that it's more dangerous not to have that institution because the centralization of power in Washington, distant from us, has proven itself to be something unquenchable in its growth and its rapacity, just its rapacious nature to take away our freedoms. And so from my perspective, it's the right check. Now, in terms of the 17th Amendment, look, we've done polling on this. Nobody's going to give up their right to vote for the U.S. Senate. How do you message that? Nobody. I mean, what would a politician run and say, you know, this is a great vehicle for my future political career. All you folks, give up your right to vote. It doesn't work. So we have to think about things more creatively. How do we get to the outcome that the founders wanted, doing something that achieves, that is actually achievable? And, the one cool thing that our political consultants have pointed out is that for 4 decades, supermajorities of Democrats and Republicans support debt limits and balanced budget limits. For 3 decades. This is intergenerational supermajority support for a concept like this that is nonpartisan, non-ideological. There's nothing else out there like this. And if we can use that desire to reinstate a small measure, maybe a large measure, depending on how badly Congress behaves, of the power that the states had in the original check and balance, let's do that. And then the other thing I just want to emphasize is it's not small potatoes or merely fiscal policy to worry about debt. I really, truly believe that aside from the concentration of unlimited power, including the power to incur debt, but that the power to incur debt is the most dangerous power of government. Because there is no normal, effective political check in a democracy on the use of that power. Why? As I pointed out, you as a politician with a time horizon of 2 to 6 years, maybe 12, have the ability to shift the cost of building pyramids to non-voting future generations. And there is no effective political check to the abuse of that power besides their conscience. And conscience is not something the founders wanted us to rely on. The same is not true about taxation, regulation, war. All of those things have real-world, immediate political consequences where there is, at least potentially, a political check. It's only debt that doesn't have that effective, real-world, contemporaneous political check, usually. And here's the other problem with debt. It creates the illusion of a replicator machine in Washington. Because there's no cost associated. We can just give you whatever you want. I mean, half of the federal government nearly is free stuff with no tax backing, right? So what grows government more effectively? The replicator machine or higher taxes? I mean, as between the two options, if you wanted to grow government, would you use the replicator machine or would you impose some pain? I mean, the problem is, if you really want to shrink government, if you want government to have limits and priorities and so on, if you want to get back to the original constitutional design, if you keep the unlimited power to incur debt in play, and you have this replicator machine, you're never going to have a serious argument with anyone who isn't already agreeing with you. Because to the non-ideological person, the politicians themselves included, it just looks like they just stand around and they get free stuff. So what's all this talk about the Constitution? So I think that debt is actually a fundamental problem, not just a fiscal issue. And that's why 49 states have a debt limit. Because in the 19th century, it wasn't always the case, but in the 19th century, we saw the first bailout and government corporate kind of combos with, canal companies and railroad companies, and everybody was borrowing on government credit to build bridges to nowhere, and this was standard practice, and state after state was just going bankrupt, literally bankrupt, from like the 1840s all the way up to the early decade of the 1900s. And all of these states saw this, particularly states that were coming into being, and they said, you know what? We need a structural fix here. There's a problem. And over time, other states learned from the newer states. So one of the benefits we have is, I often get challenged, well, you're no James Madison. No, I'm not. In fact, I could be a quarter of a James. I could be a tenth of a James Madison. I'm standing on his head. I could see farther than James Madison did. I could see the experiments that have happened since James Madison. I don't have to be anywhere near as smart or creative or anything as James Madison, because I've got that advantage, which is huge. And I think that the history shows us that debt is the most dangerous component of government, short of like killing people.
And I want to respond from the constitutional perspective. We as a country under President Bill Clinton had a balanced budget, and we didn't need to amend the Constitution to do it. So we have seen as a country that we can actually achieve this same result without tinkering with our foundational, sacred, not only form of government, but this document, as you said, how would it look in the world community to see the United States, and you know and I know, you may try and target it to a balanced budget amendment, but can you imagine what that's going to look like on C-SPAN? Because all the outsiders, all the fringe groups, legalize pot now, stop killing fetus, no gay marriage, Sodom and Gomorrah, all those signs. It will be a constitutional circus. Now, the question is, does that make it a constitutional crisis? Not necessarily. Where I like this dialogue and why I want to keep seeing this issue debated, considered, evaluated, is because what Article 5 does as a valid check is if you get about 28 or 30 states, you get 34 states saying they're about to pass this compact, you're going to see something happen in Congress. They will circumvent, and this is what has happened in the past. Congress will step in to circumvent the Article 5 process because they're like, hold on, this is going to get really ugly. So there's a very high value, not only to this dialogue, but to everything Nick and his institute is doing. I stand behind, because I think the political pressure will be much more effective than an actual Article 5 Constitution. It's the threat. It's the fear that our Constitution would get back to however we want to debate this language and whether we have the historical agreement of what happened. This political process and power is a way to check the current Congress without ever having to tinker with the sacred nature of the Constitution. Because Congress will be involved, the Supreme Court will be involved, the President may be. I mean, the problem with the text of Article 5, as you're reading Federalist 85, pull up the text of Article 5. My guess is before today you probably didn't spend any time looking at it. But when you read Article 5, it's very ambiguous at best. It's not unclear, like much of the other Constitution. So where do we turn to expound that usually? United States Supreme Court. Or we're going to allow Congress. And I'm not convinced Congress couldn't filibuster. I mean, what check do we have to do the Article 5 process? So now you're going to have this whole terrible political sideshow, and then the constitutional approach we've taken in the past is going to look quite weak, quite vulnerable, and I don't know that it's a bad thing. I'm not going to sit here, and if you've had me in constitutional law, you know I start class by saying it's a flawed document. And by the end of class, most students will come up to me and go, wow, I don't really like the way that we've interpreted and the court has seemed to now take equal protection, which if you're a historian, equal protection, the Slaughterhouse cases told you it was intended for one group only, that was freed slaves. To be bringing up in gay marriage, I think the people that were alive during the ratification of the Civil War amendments would be mortified. We have come so far from the original design. And so the conflict also, both of us are relying on history, but history has become somewhat irrelevant in the interpretation of the Constitution. Some justices abide by it, some justices don't. Many of these, if not most of these controversies, ultimately find themselves at the feet of the United States Supreme Court. Anytime you get close to a constitutional crisis, the court has stepped in. Bush versus Gore is your best example.
Yeah, I guess the comment that I would have is, if we do nothing, let's say we do nothing, the status quo is everything you just did. You know, in other words, we have to get away from the idea that politics is like a boxing match where there's just a knockdown blow and it's over. Politics is like jiu-jitsu. You're grappling for 15 rounds. You're using weight against weight, chokeholds against chokeholds. There's never a clear end point until you're both dead tight, right? And the problem is that if we don't use Article 5, let me tell you something. Barry Levinson and his gang, they're gonna use it. And if you look at the way demographic change is going, and you look at the way that political knowledge and influence is going, and ideology is going, the trends aren't looking good to hang around and wait 20 years until they use it. So unilateral disarmament should not be an option. Unilateral disarmament never works. The fact that there are uncertainties and messiness to the process, well, guess what? That's life. It is just the way the political process is. And we have to be courageous enough to engage and fight it out until we literally can't move